They say the desert never forgets. Every grain of sand holds a secret, and every gust of wind carries whispers from the past. In the daylight, the desert feels endless, calm, even beautiful. But at night, it changes. It becomes something else entirely. The silence grows heavy, the darkness stretches forever, and the road ahead feels like it has no end. On Egypt's long desert highways, there is one story every driver knows. A story that has been passed from mouth to mouth, from old truckers to the young ones who are just starting their journeys. A story of a man who once lived among them, a driver like any other. But now his name carries fear. His name is spoken only in hushed tones, because those who speak it too often say the shadows start listening. His name was Anis el-Barrawi. Once he was just another face on the road, a man with a strong laugh, a cigarette always between his fingers, and stories to share at every truck stop. But one night, under a sky with no moon, something happened. Some say it was a crash, some say it was murder. Some whisper that Anis simply vanished into the sand. But one thing is certain, Anis never left the road. Drivers say they see him still, sometimes walking along the shoulder of the highway, his figure barely visible in the headlights, sometimes standing by a broken-down truck that isn't really there, and sometimes, if you are very unlucky, sitting in your passenger seat, silent, staring, waiting. The legend grew with every telling, and like all legends, it began with stories. Stories from men who swore they had nothing to gain by lying, men who returned pale, trembling, forever changed after meeting the ghost of Anis el-Barrawi. This is the first of those stories. It was late in the night when Hassan, a long-haul driver, set out from Cairo with a truck full of supplies. His route took him across the endless desert road that led toward the Red Sea. Hassan was used to driving alone. He liked the silence, the freedom, the way the road stretched endlessly ahead of him. But that night felt different. The road was too quiet. Not even the usual hum of distant engines could be heard. The desert around him seemed to swallow every sound, leaving only the faint growl of his own truck. The sky was dark, the stars hidden behind thick clouds. Hassan lit another cigarette, rolled down the window, and tried to shake off the unease creeping into his chest. Hours passed. The road never changed. Sand, darkness, silence. Then, somewhere in the distance, Hassan saw it, a shape. A figure standing by the roadside, barely illuminated by the glow of his headlights. At first, he thought it was a stranded traveler, maybe another driver whose truck had broken down. It wasn't unusual. Hassan slowed down, cautious but ready to help. As his truck rolled closer, the figure became clearer. It was a man, tall, dressed in dark clothes. He stood unnaturally still, facing the road, his head slightly tilted. Hassan leaned forward, squinting. Something about the man was wrong. His face, It was pale, too pale, almost glowing under the weak light. Hassan's grip on the wheel tightened. When he was close enough, the figure suddenly turned his head. Their eyes met. Hassan gasped, nearly swerving off the road. The man's eyes were black, not dark, not shadowed, black, completely, impossibly black, as if someone had hollowed out his soul and left only darkness behind. And then, as quickly as he had appeared, the figure was empty again. One moment he was there, staring into Hassan's headlights. The next, the road was empty again. Hassan slammed the brakes, his truck shuddering to a stop. He jumped out, his flashlight shaking in his hand as he scanned the sand on both sides of the road. Nothing. No footprints. No sign of anyone. Just silence. Hassan climbed back into his truck, his heart hammering against his ribs. He told himself he was tired, imagining things, that the desert played tricks on lonely drivers. But deep down, he knew. He had heard the stories. He had seen the man. He had seen Anis el-Barawi. After that night, Hassan was never the same. Other drivers noticed it immediately. His laughter was gone. His hands trembled whenever he lit a cigarette. He spoke less, and when he did, his voice was always low, as if he was afraid the shadows might be listening. Eventually, after weeks of silence, Hassan told his story at a roadside cafe. The other drivers leaned in, their cigarettes burning low, the steam from their tea curling in the air. They didn't laugh, they didn't mock him. They only nodded, each of them remembering their own silent drives through the desert, their own moments of fear. And so, the legend of Anis grew. With every telling, it grew darker, heavier, more terrifying. Some men swore they had seen him too. Some claimed they heard footsteps in their empty cabins. Others whispered that when they drove too long without resting, they felt a presence in the back seat, watching, waiting. But Hassan's story remained the one that spread the farthest, the first to give the ghost a name, the first to bring the legend of Anis el-Barawi into the open. The desert road remained unchanged. It stretched endlessly, swallowing light and sound, hiding its secrets in the sand. And every time a driver set out at night, every time a pair of headlights cut through the darkness, the fear was there. Was the man they saw just a shadow? Or was it Anis, waiting to be seen again? This was only the beginning. 3 encounters, 3 witnesses, 3 pieces of a nightmare that refused to be buried. Tonight, we begin with Hassan, but his story is just the first step into the dark. The road is long, and Anis el-Barawi is still waiting. When Hassan finished his story, the room didn't breathe for a long time. Tea went cold in cups. Cigarettes burned down to the filter. Men who had spent their lives on the night roads looked at one another with that small, awful recognition you get when a rumor becomes a warning. It's one thing to hear about ghosts in a cafe. It's another to watch a man who met one speak the name without flinching. Names anchor stories. They make them real. And the name they whispered that night, Anis al-Barakwi, felt as solid as the table under their hands. They passed the cigarette around. Someone told a joke to break the tension. It fell flat. So the stories continued. That night, one of the men, older and quieter than the rest, cleared his throat and said, "You haven't heard the full thing. There's one who saw him close. He saved more than his own life." The room leaned in. The story needed a face, a voice. It needed the man who had stepped from the story into a life that could not be the same again, Wasim. Wasim had driven that highway since he could remember. If the road had names, it knew his. He could tell you where a pothole started by the smell of the soil at the shoulder. He could tell you how the tar changes after a certain bridge because of the sea wind. He kept the Quran on the dash. He kept his hands calloused and steady. He never chased a ghost when daylight would do. But like most drivers, he knew the nights held a different currency, the kind you paid in attention and sometimes in blood. On the night he met Anis, the world felt ordinary in the way a photograph looks ordinary until you notice the tiny detail that makes the whole thing wrong. The moon was a thin coin. The radio buzzed with recitation. The cargo behind him thumped softly, a measured heartbeat in the dark. He was halfway between the toll booth and the Barulis exit, the stretch that smelled of the sea when the wind turned, and he was thinking about nothing. He was thinking about the woman he had promised to call when he reached the next rest stop, about a delivery he had to make by dawn. The road was a straight promise, and he was honest with it. Then something glimmered at the edge of his headlights. At first, it might have been a road sign, he told himself. Maybe a marker. Or a man standing and waiting like all the men who stand on lonely roads hoping for a ride. He breathed out and eased the truck, thinking a quick stop would be polite and safe. He slowed, the trailer yawing slightly in the light, and the roadside resolved into a figure. It was an old man, plain at first in the dim, until the light carved details. A long gray galabeah, hair white to his shoulder, a thin face that might have been carved from bone. But the eyes did not belong to what you expected of age. They were alive in a way that did not fit the rest of him, bright, focused, oddly lucid. Wasim clicked the cab light off, more out of habit than bravado, and climbed down. The night air had a sharp, icy tang of the sea. When the old man turned toward him, small motions like a man making a request, Wasim felt something in his throat tighten. "Late," the man said. His voice was quiet, sure, the kind of voice that comes from someone who speaks little but means much. "You're late." Wasim asked him how he knew his name before he could stop himself. The question surprised him. It was private. Names in the desert are the closest thing to currency and to confession. The old man smiled, the kind of smile that might be polite or might be a wound. "I waited for you," he said. "I've been waiting, Wasim." The old man climbed into the passenger seat without asking. There was something about his motion that made it seem as if he belonged there, as if the cab had been prepared for him all along. The instant his weight hit the seat, Wasim noticed the touch of cold, a deep, startling cold that ran like winter through summer. The leather, the air, somehow everything near him shivered. For a breath he thought the night had tilted. Then a scent filled the cab. Salt and old incense, the smell of tide-washed nets and dark, locked rooms where fishermen used to sleep with prayers under their pillows. Wasim had smelled houses like that as a boy. The smell seemed to come from the man, as if he carried an entire shore in his clothes. "You shouldn't be out here," Anis said, looking straight ahead as if memorizing the road. "There's a long slick ahead. It comes from the sea wind. Do not stamp the brakes when you see it. Let the truck breathe. Keep your foot easy." Wasim, who had 100 reasons to not believe in anything other than careful driving and checked loads, laughed a little. "Slicks happen in storms. It's summer. Oil doesn't gather in the heat." But Anis's hands found the stick of the cab like a man finding a walking cane whose weight he'd memorized. Not all slicks wait for storms. Some wait for wind. Some wait for those who do not listen. There was an old certainty in the man's voice that felt like a rope thrown to someone who had spent the night lost. Wasim glanced down at the seat. The leather was cold still. The gear stick trembled in his palm as he shifted into gear. The truck moved on. The road opened like a throat. There was a curve he knew well, the one where the old green cafeteria had stood years ago, and then closed, and then people stopped missing it, as if the closing were another kind of forgetfulness. "They closed it," he said, and his voice carried the kind of nostalgia that made Wasim feel younger and older at the same time. I asked the question everyone wants to ask at a point like this. "Are you from around here? What do you want?" The old man smiled again, and for a heartbeat he thought the man might be nothing but an old man far from home. Then he said quietly, "My daughter waits for me. I must reach her." When they came to the kink in the road before Borulus, Anis's hand rose, and he said, "Slow." Wasim obeyed. He eased the accelerator, downshifted carefully. The cab rolled along as if on a long, patient breath. He felt the truck move differently, like someone guiding a sleeping animal. Headlights flared against something that should not have been there. It was not water, not simply spilled fuel. It was a long black sheen across the tarmac, a slick that stretched and glinted like a polished rug. The painted lines on the road stood on it like woven threads, moving as if the wind lifted them. For 200 meters, the surface shimmered, and the shimmer made the road look like glass. It was a place that hated traction. It was a place that loved to take. For a second, panic rose in Wasim like bile. If he had hit the brakes hard, a reflex any driver knows by muscle, the truck would have slid, then spun, and perhaps folded into the ditch. He thought of the times he had seen a tractor flip and heard the call go out for ambulances that arrived too late. But Anis's voice was calm. He said, "Ease. Do not stamp the brake. Let it pass." Wasim obeyed and eased the gears, the truck moving as if through molasses. Every inch a negotiation. The trailer danced but did not flip. For long, measured seconds, the truck seemed to float over the black river, and when the last thread of sheen slid past, the night returned to its usual thickness. Wasim headed to one of the checkpoints beyond the curve. He climbed down, legs heavy, heart still racing, and told Ahmed Rabi, the man in the cargo, how the old man had known his name, the scent of the sea, the seat like ice. Ahmed Rabi listened without blinking and pulled out a file that looked older than both of them put together. It had a brown cover, the edges soft with handling. Across it, in a thick black marker, someone had written a name, Anis El Barakwi. Wasim's knees went weak. He had not told Ahmed Rabi the old man's name. He had not told him anything beyond the facts of what had happened. Yet here was the name, written and waiting as if the desk had been expecting him. Ahmed opened the file slowly and laid out things that laced together like a net. Photocopies of yellowing newspaper clippings, a black and white photograph of a man standing before a small fishing boat, smiling shyly.
A police report from a night in 1997 that described an overturned truck, a family's screams, a sack of gifts spilled on the road. Beneath it, in a different type of handwriting, were notes, other men's names, other nights. "It's not a new story," Ahmed said. "We get them every few years. Different drivers, same details. An old man appears, warns a driver, and then..."
Mehdi had always been the kind of man who believed that night was a test. He worked long shifts, often driving through the outer roads of Cairo, where the streetlights thinned and the horizon bled into a silent, endless dark. On that particular night, the air was heavy with dust carried in from the desert, and the road stretched like a vein of asphalt across a body too vast to understand. The radio in his car spat static more often than music, and every so often he swore he could hear a voice tucked inside the interference, whispering words he almost recognized. He kept one hand on the steering wheel, the other tapping nervously against his leg. He didn't know why he was restless. He only knew that for the past week, sleep had been a war he was losing. It was the same dream again and again, a man in the cemetery, a man whose face blurred like smoke, standing beside a grave with a name Mehdi could never quite make out. Each time he woke, his chest ached like someone had pressed a cold stone against it. That night, his route pulled him near the district where the stories of Anis Berraoui had been muttered for decades. Mehdi didn't believe in curses, but he knew enough about people to understand that some stories are carried like diseases. You don't catch them unless you get close, and once you do, they live in your head forever. He thought of turning the car around, but fuel was expensive and his delivery was urgent. The faster he finished, the sooner he could go home and fight for another hour of broken sleep. The road narrowed past the last cluster of shops. He caught sight of the iron gate of the old cemetery rising against the headlights. It loomed higher than it should have, black bars set into crumbling stone, the kind of place that looked abandoned but somehow guarded. He tried not to stare, but his eyes betrayed him. Behind the gate, a shape shifted. Maybe just a stray dog, maybe not. His foot pressed harder against the accelerator. He told himself not to look into the rearview mirror, but when the radio static surged again, when the whisper came sharper than before, he couldn't resist. The mirror reflected the empty road behind him, except it wasn't empty. For the briefest second, there was a figure walking along the center line, its head tilted low, its arms slack at its sides. The headlights didn't reach it, yet the figure glowed faintly like the edges of its body were traced by moonlight no one else could see. Mehdi's breath left him in a ragged burst. He blinked. The mirror showed nothing. By the time he reached the warehouse where he had to unload, his palms were raw with sweat. The foreman asked if he was sick because Mehdi looked pale and jittery, but he only shook his head. He worked silently, carrying boxes into the echoing dark, and every slam of the metal door sounded too much like a shovel striking earth. Later, driving back, he thought he saw the same figure again, this time not in the mirror, but ahead, walking the roadside. It was taller now, or maybe closer. He refused to slow down. He pressed his body against the wheel as if merging into the machine itself would make him invisible. As the car passed, he felt a pressure along his temples, like someone brushing his skull with cold fingertips. His stomach knotted. He didn't dare glance sideways, but from the corner of his eye, he caught the impossible. The figure didn't move as the car rushed past. It stayed there, right at his window,
floating at the speed of his fear. Mehdi shouted. The car swerved. He slammed the brakes. Tires screeched, dust rose, and when the silence crashed back, the road was empty. His chest hammered against the seatbelt. His throat burned from the scream he hadn't realized was still echoing inside. He stayed like that for long minutes, shaking, until the first streaks of dawn crept against the sky. By then, his body had decided for him. He would never take this road again, never let the cemetery come near his eyes, never test the night in this way. He drove home, and for the first time in months, he locked his door twice, drew the curtains tight, and sat awake until the sun rose high. But dreams are not loyal to distance. That night, when Mehdi finally slept, the dream returned, sharper than ever. He was standing in the cemetery. He knew it was the same place because the stone walls dripped with age and the iron gate yawned open like a mouth. There was no wind, there was no sound, only him and the grave and the man. The man's body was clear now, a thin frame wrapped in black coat, his posture too stiff for life, but too restless for death. His eyes were closed, but Mehdi felt them anyway, felt them pierce his skull like nails. The grave's name was no longer hidden. It read Anis Berraoui. The letters were carved deep, filled with shadow, but they pulsed like they had been written in blood still wet. Mehdi tried to run. His legs didn't move. He tried to scream. His throat clamped shut. The man stepped closer, silent, deliberate, and when he stopped just inches away, his eyes opened. They were black. Not the color black, but the absence of anything, a hole into which all light was swallowed. Mehdi woke with his sheets soaked. His body smelled like earth. His nails were packed with grit. He staggered to the bathroom, washed his hands again and again, but the dirt wouldn't leave. The more he scrubbed, the deeper the shadow beneath his skin spread. By morning, his neighbor heard him muttering through the walls, words that made no sense, words that sounded like they belonged to someone else's tongue. Over the next week, Mehdi's life unraveled. He lost his job after missing shifts. His friends stopped answering his calls. His own reflection began to tremble in the mirror as if it didn't want to be seen with him. Every night he dreamed of the cemetery. Every morning he carried something back from it. Sand in his shoes, scratches across his arms, the taste of iron on his tongue. Once he woke with a bruise shaped like a handprint across his chest, pressed hard enough that the skin cracked. He became obsessed with the stories. He searched newspapers, old police records, whispered rumors on late-night forums. All of them led back to the same legend, Anis Berraoui, the man buried alive after betraying his own blood. A man whose screams never stopped echoing beneath the soil. Some claimed he cursed the land, some that he wandered still, offering bargains to those desperate enough to stand before his grave. Mehdi didn't know what to believe. He only knew that every time he read the name, his body shook with recognition, like his blood already knew it. It was on the 8th night that he broke. The dream had ended differently this time. Instead of standing before Anis, he had been standing inside the coffin, pressed against the lid, his mouth stuffed with earth, his lungs clawing for air. He woke not in bed, but on the floor, nails torn from digging into the wooden boards. His mouth was full of soil, actual soil. His pillow was black with it. By morning, his neighbor heard him muttering through the walls, words that made no sense, words that sounded like they belonged to someone else's tongue. Over the next week, Mehdi's life unraveled. He lost his job after missing shifts. His friends stopped answering his calls. His own reflection began to tremble in the mirror, as if it didn't want to be seen with him. Every night he dreamed of the cemetery. Every morning he carried something back from it. Sand in his shoes, scratches across his arms, the taste of iron on his tongue. Once he woke with a bruise shaped like a handprint across his chest, pressed hard enough that the skin cracked. He became obsessed with the stories. He searched newspapers, old police records, whispered rumors on late-night forums. All of them led back to the same legend, Anis Berraoui, the man buried alive after betraying his own blood, a man whose screams never stopped echoing beneath the soil. Some claimed he cursed the land, some that he wandered still, offering bargains to those desperate enough to stand before his grave. Mehdi didn't know what to believe. He only knew that every time he read the name, his body shook with recognition, like his blood already knew it. It was on the 8th night that
When the police report about Mehdi's disappearance circulated through the narrow streets of Cairo, it read like nothing more than another case of a man who lost his mind. Driver, abandoned vehicle, the report said. Witnesses describe erratic behavior. Subject located days later in deteriorated state. Nothing about cemeteries, nothing about whispers, nothing about the grave of Anis Berraoui. Official language always stripped horror down to bones, clean and sterile. But the people who lived near the cemetery knew better. They had heard the voices. They had seen Mehdi wandering toward the gates with eyes already hollow. They had watched him sit by the stone until something in him dissolved. And now, when the night was heavy and the radios hummed, they swore they could hear his muttering stitched into the static. Wasim read the report 3 times. He was not a policeman. He was not a journalist anymore either. But after what he had seen, the shifting figure in the graveyard, the impossible stillness of Anis's shadow, he could not walk away. He traced Mehdi's name through the ink like it was a thread pulling him deeper into the same pit. He knew the pattern was not random. First whispers, then sightings, then the collapse of a life. Always the grave at the center. Always Anis Berraoui. He returned to the cemetery. He told himself it was for investigation, that his recorder and camera would keep him anchored in the rational. But when the gate creaked open, he felt the same weight Mehdi must have felt, as if the air itself leaned closer, pressing against his skin, urging him forward. Rows of graves stretched like crooked teeth, and in the distance the stone marked with Anis's name pulsed faintly against the dim sky. Wasim forced himself to sit. He set the recorder on the ground, its red light blinking. He spoke into the darkness. He asked about Mehdi. He asked about the rumors. He asked if the dead could bargain. His own voice sounded foreign, swallowed up as soon as it left his lips. For a long moment, there was nothing, only the ticking of the machine. Then a whisper slid across the tape, not through the air, but inside the device itself. A second voice, thin, broken, repeating one phrase over and over,
Still breathing, still breathing. Wasim's hand trembled as he shut it off. He didn't remember leaving, only the sudden awareness that he was back in his apartment, staring at the recorder on his desk. He replayed the tape, his voice steady, asking questions. Silence, then the whisper, a whisper that did not belong to him. He played it again, again. Each time the words shifted slightly, not still breathing, but steel breathing, as if the voice was learning how to shape itself with each repetition. Sleep abandoned him. In the corners of his apartment, shadows gathered too thickly. In mirrors, his reflection twitched a moment later than his movements. He began to see Mehdi in his dreams, sitting by the grave, lips moving soundlessly. And behind him always the figure of Anis, eyes closed, waiting.
By the third night, Wasim knew he could not carry this alone. He reached out to Layla, an old colleague from his days at the newspaper. She was skeptical, but when she heard the tape, her face drained of color. "That's not an interference," she whispered. "That's a voice." She agreed to join him on the next visit. Together, they entered the cemetery, carrying not just recorders, but cameras, night vision lenses, equipment scavenged from years of unfinished projects. The gate resisted them this time, metal screeching like it wanted to stay shut. Inside, the air tasted metallic, sharp against their tongues. They reached the grave. The name of Anis Berawi seemed carved deeper than before, shadows filling the grooves. Layla set the camera. Wasim placed the recorder. They asked nothing at first, only waited. Minutes stretched, then the camera blinked, a flicker across the screen. A shadow moved behind them, though nothing stood there. The recorder clicked. The whisper returned, clearer now, almost human. "You breathe because I allow it." Layla gasped, nearly dropped the camera. Wasim forced himself to stay still. He asked, voice breaking, "Who are you?" Silence, then a scrape, low and grinding, like nails against stone. The camera shuddered, though no one touched it, and then a shape formed in the lens, tall, cloaked, head tilted. The figure leaned closer until its cracked face filled the frame, eyes closed, lips trembling as though ready to open. They fled, equipment abandoned, fear heavier than their bodies could carry. Back in the apartment, Layla refused to speak. She deleted the footage, every file, trembling as she pressed the keys. "Some doors," she whispered, "are not meant to be opened." She left before dawn, and Wasim never saw her again. Alone, Wasim reviewed the fragments left on the recorder. This time, the voice was layered. Two voices. Anis, deep and hollow. Mehdi, thin and trembling, speaking together, weaving into each other, until the words became a chant. Breathing stolen, breathing shared. Come closer, come closer. Wasim realized then the truth was worse than he had imagined. Anis did not haunt alone. He multiplied, pulling others into his echo, weaving their voices into his own. Mehdi was only the beginning, and Wasim had already stepped too close. The whisper now lived not just on tape, but in his ears when he walked, in the static of the television when it was off, in the rush of blood through his veins when he tried to sleep. By the end of the week, his neighbors heard him muttering to himself. At night, he wandered the hallways, pausing at each door as if listening for breath. He stopped eating. His eyes sank. And when someone finally knocked to check on him, they found his apartment empty, the walls scratched with a single phrase repeated again and again. Still breathing, still mine. Outside, near the cemetery, the whispers grew louder. Radios carried them farther. Cars passing by caught fragments in their static, and people began to speak of more sightings, more shadows tilting their heads, more dreams heavy with dirt and silence. The legend of Anis Berawi was no longer just a story. It was a contagion, and it had already begun to spread. The corridor stretched on endlessly, the air growing colder with every step. The faint glow from Richard's eyes lit the stone ahead, casting warped shadows that danced along the walls like mocking phantoms. Amelia kept close behind him, one hand gripping Michael's arm to keep him moving, the other pressed to her own chest, as though to keep her racing heart from breaking free. None of them spoke. Words seemed dangerous here, like they might echo too far and stir something waiting in the dark. The silence was not empty. It pulsed, alive, filled with the sound of their own shallow breaths and the almost imperceptible hum that came from Richard's body. The tunnel widened suddenly, spilling them into a vast chamber that seemed impossible beneath the earth. The ceiling arched high above, carved with spirals that disappeared into shadow. The floor was smooth, too smooth, like glass worn down by centuries of ritual. And in the center stood the altar. It was not like the crude stone slab they had seen before. This altar was massive, carved from a single block of black rock that seemed to swallow light. Its surface was etched with deep grooves that formed a pattern Amelia didn't recognize at first. But as she looked longer, her stomach churned. The grooves weren't random. They were channels winding across the stone like veins, designed to carry something from one end of the altar to the other. Blood. Amelia's knees nearly buckled. She clutched Michael's sleeve tighter, but he didn't notice. His eyes were locked on the altar with a glazed expression, as if it called to him. Richard moved forward. His steps were stiff, mechanical, but deliberate, like a puppet pulled by unseen strings. The mask fused to his face gleamed faintly, the cracks glowing with a sickly golden light. He raised his hands, palms outward, and the ground beneath them trembled. The altar stirred. The grooves filled slowly with liquid that shimmered like molten gold at first. But as it flowed further, the color darkened, thickened,
until it was unmistakably blood. The smell hit them all at once, iron and rot, sharp and suffocating. Michael gagged, stumbling back. What is happening?" Richard's voice came, layered and inhuman. "The vessel must be filled. The vessel must be honored." The chamber walls shifted. Stone seemed to melt and reform, revealing alcoves they hadn't seen before. From within them came movement, figures, dozens of them, stepping out into the flickering half-light. Amelia's lantern sputtered back to life as though forced by their presence, casting just enough illumination for her to see. They were people, or had been once. Their bodies were gaunt, their skin stretched tight over bones, eyes sunken deep into sockets that glowed faintly with the same golden fire as Richard's. Their mouths hung open, whispering words too faint to make sense of. Some of them moved with jerking, broken motions. Others glided silently, their feet not touching the ground. Amelia's stomach twisted. She recognized some of them. Faces she had seen in faded photographs, in the margins of the journal, in the missing persons reports pinned to the archives. These were the lost, the ones who had come before, claimed by the house, by the ritual, by Anis Bahrawi's curse. Michael screamed, pointing toward one of them, a woman in a tattered dress whose jaw hung impossibly wide, splitting her face in two. "We have to run! We have to get out!" But there was nowhere to go. The figures encircled them, silent and relentless, herding them toward the altar. Amelia's breath hitched. She turned to Richard, desperation breaking through her fear. "Richard, fight it, please! You don't have to do this!" For a moment, just a flicker, his body trembled, his head tilting slightly as if he had heard her. But then the golden glow flared brighter, and the layered voices roared through him. The offering must be made. The altar pulsed, the grooves glowing brighter as the blood flowed thicker, faster. The air grew heavy, pressing down on Amelia's chest until she could barely breathe. Then, from the far side of the chamber, another voice cut through the din, a voice that didn't belong to Richard or to the chanting whispers, a voice she recognized, though she had never heard it in person. "Enough!" The crowd of figures stilled. The whispers died away. Even Richard froze, his glowing eyes fixed on the far corner of the chamber. A man stepped forward, tall and gaunt, dressed in a tattered suit that looked decades old. His hair was slicked back, though strands had fallen loose over a pale, sharp face. His eyes burned with the same golden fire, but behind it was something more. Awareness, control. Amelia's stomach dropped. She knew who he was before Richard spoke the name. Anis. The man smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "You've done well," he said, his voice deep, resonant, carrying easily through the chamber. "The vessel is awake. The path is open." Michael whimpered, collapsing to his knees. No, this can't be real." Anis's gaze swept over them, lingering on Amelia. His expression softened, almost gentle. "You found my journal.
You walked the path I left. That makes you part of this now, whether you wish it or not. Amelia's chest tightened. She forced herself to speak, though her voice trembled.
Why? Why us? What is this?
Anis stepped closer, and the crowd of twisted figures parted for him, as though repelled by his presence. When the house was built, it was not just a home. It was a doorway, a bridge between what you call the living and what waits beyond. I opened it. I bound myself to it, and I have waited century after century for the vessel to awaken again. He gestured toward Richard. The man stood rigid, glowing, no longer himself. He carries it now, but a vessel is nothing without blood to fill it, without sacrifice. The altar throbbed violently, blood spilling over its edges, dripping onto the smooth stone floor. The grooves pulsed like veins, glowing brighter with each heartbeat. Amelia shook her head, tears burning her eyes.
No, we're not going to be part of this.
Anis tilted his head, his smile widening. You already are. At his word, the crowd of twisted figures surged forward. Michael screamed as hands clawed at him, dragging him toward the altar. Amelia fought, kicking, punching, but there were too many. Their grips were cold, unyielding, inhuman. She felt herself pulled forward, closer and closer to the black stone, slick with blood. Richard raised his hands again, the mask glowing so brightly it seared her vision. His voice and Anis and countless others merged into one thunderous command. The vessel must be filled. Amelia thrashed, her voice breaking in a desperate scream that echoed through the chamber, swallowed instantly by the darkness around them. And then the altar opened. The stone split down the middle, revealing not rock, but flesh, pulsing, throbbing, alive. A gaping maw stretched wide, lined with teeth that weren't teeth, but shards of bone, slick with blood. The air filled with a sound that was not a sound at all, but the vibration of something vast awakening. The vessel was not Richard. It was not the mask. The vessel was the house itself. The silence that followed the summoning was heavier than any scream. The circle of symbols on the ground had collapsed into nothingness, swallowing the light, the bones, and the echoes of the two who had been dragged into its maw. The air no longer trembled, but it carried a residue, like ash after fire, clinging to the lungs with every breath. Anis stood at the center of the ruined hall, utterly still. His form was both sharply human and monstrously wrong, like the shadow of a man painted across a surface that could not hold its shape. His lips moved, but for a moment no sound came out. Then, softly, like a prayer, he whispered, "The door is open, one of many." He lowered his hands, his eyes, still glowing faintly red, flickered with something almost like satisfaction. Then he turned toward the broken archway of the hall, his footsteps unnervingly calm, leaving behind no trace of what had just unfolded. But though Anis left, the memory of what had happened did not die. It traveled outward like a pulse, a wave that rattled across the city. Far away, on the edges of the sleeping streets, lights began to flicker and die. Families woke to find the night colder than it had any right to be. A child woke screaming a name he had never heard before, Anis, and when his mother held him close, she too began to shake, her tears flowing for reasons she couldn't explain. Somewhere in a distant hospital, a patient in a coma opened his eyes for the first time in years. His first word was a whisper, choked and dry. He has returned. The consequences of the ritual were spreading like cracks in glass. Inside the collapsing hall, though no one remained to see it, faint imprints of footsteps burned into the stone. Footsteps leading deeper, not toward the exit, but downward, as though Anis had walked both out into the city and further below into the earth at the same time. Reality itself had begun to fold around him. And yet, the story of Wasim and Mahdi had not ended, not fully. For though their bodies had been consumed by the circle, something of them lingered, not flesh, not thought, fragments, whispers, their terror, their resistance, their cries, all caught within the unseen current that Anis had stirred. At first, the remnants were faint, an echo in the stones, a shadow on the wall. But slowly, painfully, they grew louder. A week later, a group of construction workers entered the abandoned district where the ritual had taken place. They had been hired to assess the old buildings for demolition. The hall was on their list. They entered laughing, carrying flashlights, joking about ghosts, but inside the air silenced them. The youngest of them, Karim, swore he heard something, a whisper. He turned sharply. Who said that? Nobody had. Then another voice, and another. The workers began to panic. They dropped their equipment. Their lights flickered. One by one, they ran. Only Karim stayed, frozen, listening. The whispers grew clearer, words now. Don't trust him. Don't follow him. The door. Close the door. He stumbled backward, fell onto the cracked floor, and when he shone his light at the wall, he saw two shadows cast against it. One tall and lean, the other shorter, broader, both flickering like candlelight. Voices in unison, "We are not gone." Meanwhile, Anis moved freely through the city. People saw him and didn't see him. To some, he was a stranger passing by. To others, he was a friend they hadn't spoken to in years, suddenly returned. To children, he appeared in dreams, offering them secrets wrapped in riddles. But the most terrifying part wasn't his presence. It was the changes he left behind. Birds falling dead from the sky, clocks running backward, windows reflecting scenes from rooms that didn't exist, and people, ordinary people, waking up in the middle of the night with symbols burned faintly on their skin. Everywhere he went, the veil between the world and something else grew thinner. By the second week, whispers of disappearances spread. A university student vanished on his way home. A taxi driver never returned from his shift. Families began reporting strange behavior from loved ones, eyes turning black for seconds at a time, voices speaking words in languages no one understood. But the most chilling story came from a woman who claimed she had been visited by Wasim. She said he appeared at her window, pale and trembling, whispering warnings before dissolving into smoke. "He's not done," the apparition told her. "He needs more. He needs all of us." She tried to convince others, but no one believed her. Until the next day, when her body was found in her apartment, eyes wide open, her walls scrawled with the same symbols from the hall, and written in her blood, "Anis walks among you." The city grew restless. Rumors turned into panic. The government blamed gas leaks, mass hysteria, hallucinogens. They sealed the abandoned district. They sent in teams to demolish the hall. But the hall did not fall. Every attempt to destroy it failed. Machines broke. Workers vanished. Explosives detonated without effect. The walls left unscarred. The hall remained, a scar that refused to heal. And within its walls, the whispers of Wasim and Mahdi grew louder, weaving themselves into the very stones until they became something else, not merely echoes, but presences. They had been consumed, yes, but they had not been erased. One night, Anis returned. He walked into the hall, his face calm, his eyes burning faintly red. The moment he entered, the whispers fell silent. For the first time, the two shadows emerged clearly, their forms coalescing, Wasim and Mahdi. But they were no longer fully human. Their bodies flickered, their edges blurred, their voices overlapping as though spoken by many mouths at once. "Why us?" Wasim asked, his tone hollow. "Why any of us?" Mahdi followed, his words broken, echoing. Anis smiled, a real smile this time, cruel and beautiful. "Because you were curious, because you opened the door, because you listened when you should have turned away." Wasim's shade stepped forward, trembling. "Then we'll stop you." Anis laughed softly, not loud, not mocking, just certain. "You already tried, you failed, and now you belong to me." He extended his hand. The ground cracked. The symbols flared to life again, brighter, hungrier. The shadows of Wasim and Mahdi screamed, their forms bending, tearing, reshaping. They were not being destroyed. They were being remade. What emerged from the circle that night was not two friends, nor two victims. It was something else. Twin phantoms bound to Anis, their souls chained, their voices twisted into his will. And together they walked out of the hall into a city that had no idea what was coming. The story doesn't end with Anis. It begins with him, because the ritual in the hall was not the first, nor would it be the last. He had opened one door. There were many more. And as dawn broke over the trembling city, as ordinary people awoke to a world that looked the same but felt wrong, the truth seeped in like poison. Onis was not hunting victims. He was building an army. And somewhere, deep within the chains of their new forms, Wasim and Mahdi screamed silently, endlessly, their last fragments of humanity watching helplessly as their bodies carried out the will of the thing they had once called a friend. The whispers would spread, the doors would open, and the world would never close them again.